Good evening, everybody. Can I, first of all, on behalf of the Chair, the Board of Directors and staff of Footscray Community Arts Centre, welcome you here tonight to what promises to be a scintillating and timely discussion of the recent platform paper entitled It's Culture, Stupid, published by Currency House and written by the ex-Deputy Director of the Department of Premier and Cabinet, Director of Arts Queensland, Lita Brett. In fact, this is the Melbourne launch of that paper, and I would first of all like to acknowledge that we have in the audience tonight, and she will speak right at the end, the founder of Currency and the editor, Catherine Brisbane. My name is Cathy Hunt. I'm the Director of Positive Solutions, and I am the facilitator for this session. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered this evening, the Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to congratulate Footscray Community Arts Centre on its unique Elders in Residence programme. I don't think I know of anything like this anywhere else in the country. Congratulations on that one. In a moment, I will ask Lee to present her paper, to explain why she wrote it, why the title, what she left out, who she is prepared to name publicly. And in light of Minister Crean's launch of the National Cultural Policy yesterday, a few initial reactions, particularly on how some of those issues that she writes so eloquently about in the paper are reflected or not in that policy document. I will then invite our three panellists to give their brief, succinct, yet highly informed responses, I'm sure, to the contents of the paper. And I'll just briefly introduce the panel now, if I may. The full biogs of everybody are in the piece of paper you have on your seat, so I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to introduce them one by one with their titles. We have Penny Hutchinson, Director of Arts Victoria. We have Frank Panucci, Director of the Community Partnership Section of the Australia Council for the Arts. And we have the wonderful Ms. Jade Lilly, Director and CEO of Footscray Community Arts Centre. But first to Lee. Those of you who've read the paper will know that I've actually worked closely with Lee in Queensland and on national initiatives over the past 5 years, in which I have learnt so much, not just about how government works in Australia, but how to ensure good relationships and partnerships between the sector and government are created to make good outcomes for all. I also learnt that it was sometimes inappropriate and a bit unfair to make the statement, trust a bloody bureaucrat to think like that. The arts community in Queensland didn't see Lee like that. She was a true leader for the sector and for her team, both inside and outside government. She was passionate about the arts. She was passionate about the history of cultural development and expression in Australia and about her state of Queensland, as I'm sure the Australia Council knows only too well. And she was prepared to take risks. She was actually prepared to look at ways in which you could grow support for the arts in the state, but at the same time make some of those difficult decisions on withdrawing funding from those projects or organisations that were, let's say, past their sell-by date. And all the time, lurking in her mind were some unanswered questions about the whole approach and system of funding we have towards culture, including the arts in Australia. And here she is to tell you all about it. Thank you.
Scintillating, hey? It's a challenge. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you also to Footscray for the chance to have this occasion be part of this. It's just lovely to be here, and especially with Jade, who worked for me for a short space of time. And I would have been very happy if it had been longer. Why? Why write the book? I think the first thing for me was that coming into the arts from other sectors of government, the first thing that struck me and the thing that grew over time was that it's very difficult to find a rational and comprehensive framework in public policy terms. That sounds really boring to put around this thing we're working with. Every time we tried to write a mission statement, for example, people would say, but what about X? Or what about Y? And so we would find the thing that we were trying to work with, adding these pimples and reshaping itself constantly. So it seemed to me, the other thing that I identified with that is that a lot of the really powerful public policy tools that are normal things in other areas of government are really not well regarded or much used in arts bureaucracies. One of the really obvious ones is just program evaluation. There just are not a lot of systematic and good quality program evaluations which are published and available for you to look at. So I decided that it would be worthwhile to investigate this and to really try and tease out what those issues were. And at the same time, I really wanted to expose to people what some of the challenges are for arts bureaucracies and to defend arts bureaucrats a bit. I mean, is there a sort of more pejorative term than arts bureaucrat? Even in bureaucracies. Like, this is the bottom of the bureaucratic ladder as well as it is the bottom of the arts ladder. So what you have is a book which is a little bit autobiography, a little bit who is that minister, and quite a lot of public policy text, and I hope that's useful and interesting to you too. Why the title? Well, originally, and Kathy came up with the title, originally it was because we're so frustrated at being pushed into defining ourselves in terms of economics and social outcomes. And you would find people going up with proposals for festivals which were all about visitor nights and tourism, the impact on the tourism economy, and you didn't get to talk about why it was important and useful to do that festival in cultural terms. And I refer in the book to discovering at one stage that we were described, the only appearance Arts Queensland had in the Premier and Cabinet strategic plan was our contribution to Indigenous employment and to volunteering statistics. And this is when you think, marginal, this is marginal. So the title, actually, as I worked through the paper, became the thesis of the paper itself, which is, in a way, if I put it succinctly, is that by focusing on particularly the stuff about arts development and funding, and that's the stuff that the public, that the media are interested in, where all the fights and debates are, we're actually contributing to this marginalisation ourselves. We're not using the language, we're not using the persuasion, and we're not bringing to government the interest of the citizen, the impact of our work, and so we're helping to keep ourselves marginalised. In the paper, I talked about a planning exercise we went through, which was nothing spectacular. We decided it would be good to try to write plans about our intentions. And the interesting thing from that process was that it became very clear to me that politicians themselves are not that interested in this stuff. They actually like the idea of themselves as patrons and the idea that they have money to sprinkle on bits they like, and they're happy to leave the money to the end of the queue and then pick up the little bits and enable things, and that gives them a great sense of their power and influence and a great sense of gratification and association with something glamorous. I worked with Penny on a plan to try and create a sort of work program for the cultural ministers, and we got eventually to the cultural ministers' offices, having worked hard and thought through it all. We got to the cultural ministers' meeting, and it had gone then from a policy to a plan to an agenda to a framework for collaboration, and you can see it kind of declining in importance. And then the Commonwealth Minister of the day said, you can do all the strategy you like, I won't have my hand stayed. And I thought about that phrase afterwards, and I thought you could hardly think of a more kind of trenchant expression of, I reserve the right to be a patron. And surprisingly, when the lovely Anna Bligh launched the paper in Sydney, she told a different version, a different story, but with the same message. Legislation, frameworks, policy is great, but in fact, in the end, it's the capacity to do things outside the frameworks that might make the difference. It's important for us to understand that even within the system of government, there are these different views. Of course, you couldn't write about the arts without talking about competitive funding. And I laid out a program reform process that we went through just for the sake of accounting for it in a way. What it highlighted for me is that, of course, competitive funding is a standard way of rationing public money, but what it really highlighted for me was the clash of cultures between the sector and government. You know, if things get off the rails a bit in government, what you do is tighten the guidelines and write more guidelines and add more steps in the process. And you understand, you know, you guys know that. What is the least helpful thing that you can do when you're in that situation? So you see some programs with guidelines so elaborated that the government itself has no room to move. But this is actually in response to criticism and the feeling that the program's not working. The other thing about competitive funding, of course, is that I just came to the conclusion it's not the best way to deal with your own invested capital. You might have funded something for 15 years and then pulled the plug on it. It's also not the best way to deal with the expertise that has been built up in these organisations over time. And it produces bad outcomes. And I talked about a culture of fear and dependence, and those two things being the opposite sides of that relationship. The other thing, of course, and I can say this with Frank here, is that then you have overlapping criteria. You have what I call the taxonomic war. They have criteria, and theirs are different from ours. And so, particularly for the small to medium sector, organisations are caught in this war of bureaucratic taxonomies, which must fractionate, must divide your brain entirely. But when I look at the long-term outcomes of that sort of process, I got down to the bit about money and what we do with the money, and you can only come to the conclusion that it's less than optimal. And it's fascinating to think about. If you bring the tools from other policy areas, we don't fund schools this way. We don't say there's a fixed pool of money, you can have as many schools as it'll fund, and the old ones have to go after a while because we're tired of them. We'll add a few newies because we want a different perspective. We accept that schools are an essential service, and we allow the budget to grow, and particularly in private schooling, the number of schools to grow, even if they're small and not really viable economically. But we allow that to happen because we're responding to the idea of choice and of essential services. What struck me most about all of this is that at the end of 20 years, many of our organisations are no better off than they were when we started funding them in terms of their own stability and strength. They've accumulated knowledge and experience, they've made beautiful work, they've engaged people, changed lives, but they themselves are no more able to afford a new computing system than they were 15 years ago. And it was this learning that took me into the work with Kathy about, which started off as New Models, New Money, and some of you will know about that, but it was really to see whether it was possible to imagine new ways of using government money, not just adding a few philanthropic dollars for another project, but thinking about if I'd given this money, all this money, this 20 years of funding to this organisation at the beginning, how different might they be now? Would they be different if they'd had to manage that investment and they'd had the flexibility that goes with that? Or alternatively, if I could extend their grant for, say, 6 to 6 years, would they be better able to go and borrow for a computing system or to change their life in some significant way that would enable them to have a better trajectory and a broader funding base? And that's the work that's referred to in the cultural policy, and it's work that's ongoing that Kathy's doing in Queensland but nationally as well. One of the abiding and fundamental debates in public policy is always about the balance between your investment in institutions and service delivery and the measurement of that investment and its benefits in terms of outcomes. When we fund hospitals, we don't only look at are they good hospitals. What we're interested in is their outcome in the community. The same applies to schools. You don't measure schools just by how glamorous they are, although if you're in an education department, you do sometimes think it's all about schools and not at all about kids and parents. You then get but you think about what do schools do in terms of the outcomes, educational outcomes in our community. And I was surprised to find that in a way all those debates about equality of opportunity for citizens, who benefits from this public investment, how is it changing our community, our culture, those things are actually not, they're missing, I would call them missing in action in a way in the public debate about arts and culture. And I have come firmly to the conclusion that unless these debates become robust and we can put them centre stage, then we will always be regarded by governments as a tetchy, high-profile, annoying, subsidised industry, playing to a privileged audience and appropriately marginalised or easy to marginalise. So a couple of things at the end, I put in some recommendations. They will require governments to behave differently and essentially in the national interest rather than in their own immediate political interest. This is possible, I am pleased to tell you. There are a lot of examples in Australian public policy where governments have got together and said it'd be better if we gave this up in return for this. And it's not hard to find them. But if we are advocates for this sector, this is what we have to push them to. Australian public policy is desperately pragmatic, and I'm sure a lot of you will recognise what I'm talking about. But one of our big challenges is that we don't have great ways of expressing ourselves what the value and outcomes of our work really are. We understand this in Australia. We know what it means to a community to lose their culture. We see this played out in remote and in Indigenous communities every day. We see the impact of war on neighbouring communities where people have lost their culture and where destruction of culture is used as an instrument of war. We need to really work on this bit of the puzzle. I had, people are possibly tired of hearing this story, but I was lucky to have Simon Malloy from SKC Consulting doing a piece of work on the film industry in Queensland. The film industry measures its impact entirely in dollars and jobs, and it has fabulous statistics about who's working in the film industry and below the line and above the line employees and creatives versus caterers, and you know, it's huge. And we were having trouble selling this to the Queensland government, and one of the things Simon said to us was, look, the reason you fund the film industry is not about jobs. The reason you fund the film industry is that this is the predominant cultural medium of our time, and not to have a capacity in it is just unthinkable. And the minute you say that, you go, yeah, it's like going, we didn't need we could have passed by motor cars and we would have been all right. Think of what the film industry has done for us internationally, how we are seen overseas, how it communicates who we are, how it tells us our cultural heritage, our stories, and how we understand ourselves and share that understanding. This is the language of cultural value that needs developing, and for me, this is one of the projects which will change the way governments behave and treat arts and culture.
Thank you, Lee. I'd now like to invite Penny to make the first response to the paper.
Well, it's fantastic to have Lee here. We miss her from the table where we all sit as senior officials and talk about national issues, and it was fantastic to work with Lee, and she's made a great contribution to the national conversation by writing this paper. As you've all gathered, there are a lot of points that Lee raises and discusses in the paper, and in the time I've got available, I'm going to limit myself to perhaps picking up on three areas. One of the consistent themes throughout the paper really is about the positioning of arts and culture within government, within the public conversation about who we are, what sort of community do we want to be, and where will our ambitions take us. And also, as Lee said just towards the end of her comments, where is the language of public policy in relation to arts and culture? It's really easy to be distracted and to lose sight of the important end games. I have a lot of things that go on through my office, as many of you would know, and a lot goes on through Arts Victoria. But whatever else is in the office, on the whiteboard are a little hierarchy of words: arts, culture, and identity. And those words are there, perhaps linked with citizenship, to remind me of what we're really on about all the time. And it's really about trying to always have in our minds that we might be called Arts Victoria, we might have a minister for the arts, but we are the cultural portfolio, and the one which, you know, if it was removed, or if significant parts of it were removed, we would lose our identity and our sense of belonging. And secondly, you know, in terms of where is the portfolio, whether it's in this country or other countries, in the political hierarchy, you don't hear governments, perhaps this is a good thing, talking about arts and culture as part of election campaigns. You don't hear of ministers, and this is slightly dangerous territory at the moment, of course, in Victoria. We've had 3 arts ministers in the last 2 weeks. We have a new one who is 24 hours into the job. You know, here we have Heidi, who's been given the portfolios of women's affairs, consumer affairs and arts. She will put arts first, I'm sure. But it is typically there as a part-time job, whether you have a very senior minister like a premier or a minister who's got a range of other portfolios. So the positioning in the political hierarchy is also a difficult area. But there are good examples of arts and culture getting traction in very difficult circumstances. And Lee alluded to some of them in her remarks. The one I find quite inspiring goes back a long time, to years even before I was born, which is quite a long time ago, to just after the Second World War in England, when, you know, the country had been destroyed, there was massive national debt. But there was an economist, and not just a junior economist, but a very renowned economist, John Maynard Keynes, who was head of Treasury. And amidst all of that destruction, he worked really hard to ensure that the Arts Council of England was formed. And he recognised that in the recovery, there needed to be a sense of renewal of community and culture in those post-war years. And that legacy is just really an extraordinary legacy, but that arose in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. A second area that Lee talks about in the paper is the fact that when she got to Arts Queensland and asked for all the Acts of Parliament, of course there isn't one for Arts Queensland itself. There isn't a foundation piece of legislation for the portfolio. And, of course, there is for the Australia Council, and they're about to go through some reforming of their legislation. So you can find yourself, and it doesn't matter who's in government, with either a strong sense of policy or strategy from the particular government or minister, or you can find yourself in a situation where, as I did when I first came to the portfolio, with a relatively new government that had done a number of the things they wanted to do, but needed a sense of policy direction, and we went into policy development mode. But it is amazing to think that 40 years ago, a very visionary Premier, Treasurer and Arts Minister, Rupert Hamer, decided that when he started the Ministry for the Arts that there would be an Act of Parliament. And I just want to read a couple of tiny bits from it to give a sense of how he envisioned and foresaw some of the issues that the portfolio would need to deal with, and that in fact Lee picks up on in her paper. So he says the objects of the department are, firstly, to develop and improve the knowledge, understanding, appreciation and practice of the arts in Victoria. Secondly, to increase the availability and accessibility of the arts to the public of Victoria. And thirdly, to encourage and assist in the provision of facilities to enable the arts to be performed or displayed. You can thank him for the work we did here a couple of years ago, Jade. But it's interesting that those words do recognise the absolute importance of the public legitimacy, the community involvement in the portfolio, that it is about how we, as individual citizens and community, engage with the portfolio. He clearly foresaw that an understanding and appreciation of the arts was terribly important, and that these shouldn't be practices that are behind closed walls and in difficult venues, that was a focus on availability and accessibility. So I think, you know, for that era, and we're going back to 1972 when this Act was first enacted, we had a very visionary statement. And in times when we've needed to describe what the portfolio is all about, particularly to our bureaucratic colleagues, we've certainly used and relied on the Act to help us deliver that foundation to explain what we're really on about. And Lee, in her remarks, and certainly in the paper, and this is the third thing I'd just like to discuss briefly, talks about the whole question of how the arts portfolio is seen and how we need to really create a language and develop a language for looking at the public benefit and the public value of what we do. To be honest, I've never shirked from certainly in our budget processes and other processes within government, from saying to our colleagues, we need to be clear that there is a public benefit to this portfolio, albeit that some of it needs to be described in cultural terms. When I came, we discovered that the major agencies did not have any kind of performance agreement with government, even though it would be unthinkable these days for hospitals, say, not to have an agreement about what they're meant to deliver for the money they get. So we set about, causing the major agencies, the NGV, the library and so on, to actually have a service agreement with government. And I think a few people thought I was completely bonkers at the time, and they probably still do. But we have been able to demonstrate exactly what's being delivered for that money. And another example of that was, and Lee referred to this a bit too, that when we were working on that piece of work for Cultural Ministers' Council to give them a sense of what their priorities ought to be, we had a big session at Werribee where all the senior bureaucrats came to Melbourne, and we went to Werribee and had a forum. We talked a lot about the state of the arts sectors in our various jurisdictions, recognising the challenges and the opportunities that were there, and some of the frustrations as well that I know everybody feels. But we decided that a turning point in the conversation was when we started to say we need to look at this from the perspective of the citizen, the community, our nation, and, if you like, how Australia is seen overseas. Because it is, if we look at it through that perspective, that we're going to get a lot more traction for the sort of discussion that we were having, the sort of priorities that we wanted to put forward to the Ministerial Council. And in the end, despite the fact that the Commonwealth Minister did make the remark that Lee quoted, I'm glad you're quoting it on the recording, Lee, not me, but it did eventually get through. And I do think that some of the elements that have come through in the National Cultural Policy have reflected on some of the work that was done at that time. So I think I should hand over to Frank now, and or is it Jade going next, and further the discussion on Lee's really important paper.
Thanks, Penny. And I guess firstly, I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and also thank my fellow panellists and Kathy for accepting the invitation to come and have this conversation. And I'd also like to really honour you, Catherine, and thank you for all that you do in the sector, in the industry, and for valuing intellectual, rigorous conversation around this work. So, platform paper 34, It's Culture, Stupid, Reflections of an Arts Bureaucrat. I did have to try and sort of say that properly a number of times, and I had to keep reading it to get it right in terms of the inflection. Firstly, I'd like to thank you, Lee, for writing an insightful, intelligent and reflective commentary about your experiences within Arts Queensland, alongside your well-formed opinions and perspectives of our national context. Quite frankly, it was a pleasure to work with you in Queensland, and also to have you as the DDG of our arts agency, along with Anna Bligh as our Premier at the time. With the release of the National Cultural Policy yesterday, which some of us have quickly tried to read, that rather large document, and form an opinion, I think we are really well placed to be having this conversation as a sector. And I guess when I talk about sector, I talk about all of us. No matter where I work, in a government or a non-government context, I'm still part of this sector. And actually what happens is my sphere of influence just shifts and changes. And I think that's actually what we need to sort of keep in mind when we're reading this paper. So for me, we all have a call to action through platform paper 34. We have words and recommendations that we can take very seriously and practically as we move into the next era of arts and cultural development in Australia. Strategy, resourcing and measurement of social, cultural and economic benefit are a collective responsibility. The more we look to the Australia Council or any of our state agencies to drive this agenda on our behalf, the more vulnerable and disconnected we become. Ultimately, as Contacting says in Queensland, we are better together. Whether we work in local government, non-profit organisations, libraries, youth centres, artist collectives, galleries, philanthropic or trust foundations, we must together drive an agenda for the arts, culture, cultural expression and cultural engagement in this country and as a region. Whether we're working internationally, locally or regionally, we all have a responsibility to participate in this movement and the national agendas pertaining to arts and culture in this country. And in my mind, for those of us who are fortunate enough to be funded to do what we do, we have an additional mandate to advocate on behalf of those artists, organisations and communities who do not have access to the same platforms we have. We absolutely need to support and guide emerging and developing practitioners in this work to understand the national agendas, platforms and hubs they can access for information, knowledge, history and mentoring. We must meet our state and federal partners as partners, not as funders, but as partners in this conversation and in this vision we have together for a culturally diverse and dynamic, engaged and connected national ecology. As I read Platform 34, I also reflected on the launch I went to in Sydney, where Lee and Anna Bligh officially launched the paper and had the first kind of conversations around its content. And I do reflect, as you mentioned, Lee, about Anna being really excited about a lack of legislation and Lee being quite terrified about the fact that there wasn't anything. And I don't think I'd really thought about that from a politician's perspective before, so that was useful. But it did all make me think the downside of that is, of course, when things go terribly wrong. And unfortunately, we can look to Queensland currently as an example of disappointment and the destruction of what was considered to be a strong and strategic direction and legacy. I have to believe that the foundations by which the change takes place in our sector is not simply in the hands of one person or one government, but that the equation has to be right for the success. And in the Tibet and Bligh era, the sector was ready. The sector broadly was on board, well, most of us were, and those who weren't, maybe didn't make it through the next round. And it was time to make some big decisions, which I actually think really did pay off. I also have to believe that just because we have a changing government, potentially, in the case of Queensland, all of the thinking, ideology and ecological considerations simply can't be thrown out the window. Because the sector stays as a sector, we adapt, we transition, we guide, and hopefully we're in a position to be the stable and steady hand for communities that we need to be and not look to other people to do that for us. Quite simply, it means that the environment has changed, the weather has turned, and we need to adapt to a new climate that we're experiencing. And as the ecology continues to grow and in some ways recalibrate, we prepare for the next season, the next change, but the focus and the intention does not change. Life is still present, vision is still present, cultural engagement is still happening, and we continue to adapt and flourish in the ways we innately know how. We are resilient. So I'm really pleased also to read about measuring cultural vibrancy and some of the national conversations that are taking place around how we do that as a sector. And the inner geek in me gets really excited to talk about things like evaluation. And I just would like to close with a statement that Lee made in Sydney that I just really appreciated and I loved, is that the opposite of excellence is not access. The opposite of excellence is crap. And the opposite of access is exclusion. And I think demanding and striving for excellence in process, in planning, in conversation, and in art are essential. It's not a risk.
Which leaves us with Frank.
Okay, so the Australia Council has been mentioned a few times, and obviously it's mentioned in Lee's platform paper. And the relationship between the Australia Council and state arts agencies and local governments at times is one that's been tense at times, given the different charters we operate under and the different way that we're structured. I remember when I went back to the Australia Council, I've worked there on a number of occasions in 2005, and I had the pleasure of going to Brisbane for a meeting with Arts Queensland. And in, I think the meeting room's still called the Oodgeroo Knuckle Room, yes. There was a thermometer on the wall which measured how much money it went to Queensland from the Australia Council grant decisions, and there was a bit of a mad rush of trying to get the thermometer down before I walked in, but I already knew it was there, so it was fine. But, yes, we know, I know, Lee. But I suppose the platform paper for me that Lee's written is, I think, personally something which is overdue in Australia, which is someone who is prepared to publicly put out there what the experience has been to actually try and run an agency of that ilk, about warts and all about it, and how you try and strive to achieve the best, how you see your role as an enabler of, you know, creativity and arts in a society. And more often than not, people who've operated at Lee's level drift off. And, you know, and if we're fortunate enough to have conversations with them, we get to know some of those stories, but it's very rarely been put out in a public space. And I actually pay tribute to Lee and to Catherine for actually putting this out there. And I think that, you know, at times we don't acknowledge enough the daring, the intellectual daring that people undertake. And I think that's something that this country could learn a lot from, not just in terms of the arts. Jade spoke about access and excellence, and it was one of the things I wanted to mention as well in terms of Lee's presentation, but also in her platform paper. The juxtaposition of, you know, access and excellence, the juxtaposition of art for art's sake against its instrumental value, I find as spurious, dichotomous conversations that are put out in the public space. And Lee, in her platform paper, addresses that, I think, in a very eloquent way, and deals with them both in terms of public policy, but also pushes the agenda, and I think an agenda quite often that we don't consider enough, is the area of what are our rights as citizens in a developed country, or in any country really, and what are our rights in terms of access to and capacity to be part of the creative and artistic you know, culture and fabric of a country. So Lee actually makes references to various UN charters, some and conventions, some which Australia is signatory to, some we are not, and hopefully we may be in the future. And I think the importance of that part of the paper that Lee addresses the issues of rights is that I think it's almost through that prism that we can actually come to grips with some of the other issues that Lee raises around what are the notions of value and public good of arts and culture. Because I think at a certain point, you know, there's aspects of Lee's paper that remind me of work done by an organisation in Barcelona called InterArts. And the head of InterArts was actually in Melbourne for the International Federation of Arts Councils conference, Edward Miralles, where he actually says, you know, when we talk about whole of government, more often than not, we read things and we'll talk about, and you'll see examples in national cultural policy of arts and health, arts and disability, arts and environment, arts and this, arts and that. It's almost as if there's something wrong with the arts house, that, you know, we have to go into everyone else's house because our house, Morales says, maybe it's a bit too untidy, and so the others don't want to come to our house and play in our house. But he actually uses as an argument to go to what Lee puts in her paper, which is our responsibility at times is how do we ensure that we actually develop good public policy, so in a sense that we stand on equal footing with the others, and not always feeling as arts bureaucrats, you know, to use that beautiful term, that we are supplicants to other parts of government, that we are actually an equal partner in achieving a broader public and social outcome. And I think that, you know, the public policy conversations that Lee addresses in her paper are something that we should explore even more, and about how we move that forward. The other thing that I think that Lee, you know, addresses well, and based on some of the work done with Kathy and others, is, you know, what are the new ways of engaging with, you know, the use of both public and non-public funds in providing a sustainability and a new way for arts and cultural organisations and artists as individual practitioners and communities that are involved in creation of work can actually sustain their work over a long period of time. So the work done around new models and new monies was, I think, a stimulus to that, and interesting that it came out of Lee's time when she was still at Arts Queensland. I think that for me the issue that is addressed in Lee's paper to a certain extent, and hopefully is further expanded upon in future conversations, is to look at the issue of what sustainability is and being entrepreneurial is, but not always as it gets collapsed quite often in public conversations and in, I suppose, public policy conversations, that it becomes shorthand for commercial, and or that what we apply is commercial business models to the way that we operate things. That actually the sustainability and economic sustainability of arts organisations and artists is a different kind of model, and it does not meet those usual inverted commas market economy models or for-profit models. And so what is that design? What is that business operation model that allows us to create greater sustainability? It's most probably the most difficult part for any government agency to deal with because of restrictions about the way funds are allocated, the time span that they're allocated, all those things that revolve around that. But I think over time you might be able to get to a point where you can have a different conversation around that. The other thing that I admire about Lee's paper and the way that she's presented it is, this is a bit of a bugbear, personal bugbear, is that she doesn't shy away from the notion that we're dealing with complex issues. I think too often in a whole range of areas, complexity has become a dirty word. So we're always looking for the 30-second answer, the one-line answer, the linear answer to issues. And the reality is that the area we work in, but most areas most people work in, are complex. And when someone says there's a simple answer to a complex question or a complex issue, my hunch is always that it's wrong. And the answer, but what Lee does really well is she gives us the complexity and unpicks it for us, and in a sense provides a path through that complexity with what is, I suppose, the mix of answers that we need to do to address that. She actually, I think, presents to us the alchemy that we have to deal with. This weird science of pulling things together, pulling them apart. What is the right combination? And I think she's set us on the road for a deeper conversation. And just finally, because obviously there's issues around the National Cultural Policy that was released yesterday and direct reference to the Australia Council. I do find it interesting that some of the things, as Penny said and Jade has said as well, that were in Lee's paper and sort of said issues that need to be looked at, to a certain extent have been addressed in some aspects of the National Cultural Policy. They do need further work, I think, around some of them, but at least that conversation's been stimulated and been had, and I think that's at least the starting point that we should all be, thankful for. And I'll stop now because Kathy's lit the glass again.
I'm going to, I think it's only fair to, because I can see Lee's been scribbling away. Just very quickly, Lee, there are so many issues that have been brought up, and I was struck, I think, for the first time tonight in this particular discussion about the lack of discourse that we have been having. The problem that we have is that there are so few opportunities like this to have a discourse like this, to discuss these issues, to discuss issues that are complex in this depth, and to raise things that people don't often raise. And how can we move forward ever as a society unless we're doing these? But I thought it would be important for Lee to just respond from her point of view to what she's heard from the other panellists.
Gosh. Look, I was really overwhelmed with how affirming those responses were. Anna Bligh used that thing about the legislation to tell a fabulous story. The Whitlam government put $1 million on the table for regional art galleries, and this announcement came out on a Friday night, and local communities, it had to be matched by local governments. Local governments rushed around and looked at it, but one local government, Rex Pilbeam, Mayor of Rockhampton, said, I'll have that money. and he went out to the mining communities around Rockhampton, and over a weekend he stitched up $1 million to match, and he took the lot in one go. And Rockhampton has, as a consequence, a stunning collection of 20th century Australian art. It also has the Pilbeam Theatre, the Pilbeam Performing Arts Centre, the Pilbeam everything. But she told that story as an example of opportunism, how great it is if you don't have legislation, because you can just hop out and do that. And as Jade said, that's great when it's Anna Bligh or someone who will do that, or even Rex Pilbeam, God bless him. But there are so many times when that's not there, when that opportunity isn't there, and it's you, as Penny said, arguing with Treasury bureaucrats who say, why would I brief on $1 million? I'm dealing with a new fleet of helicopters. I don't need to brief on $1 million, you know, why would you bother? But I do find it very affirming that we are seeing in the National Cultural Policy some responses or some further thinking on the public value issue, on the language of the paper has shifted so much. When Simon Crean started to do his roadshow about the policy, so much of the discussion was about the contribution of this sector to the economy. It was basically about, we will, you know, these are the new industries which will lead us out of the end of the mining boom. If you read the introduction, the Prime Minister's introduction and his introduction now, that language is gone, and there's a genuine appreciation of the importance of culture. I have to say, just between us, it's dodgy, it's uneven. There are passages where arts and culture, creative industries and cultural industries all appear within about 3 lines of one another. But I'm so pleased to see that some of that progress has been made.
Can I just say thank you, a big thank you, first of all, to yourselves for being here tonight and listening to everybody, and a huge thank you to Lee for making this happen, for Jade for inviting us here and us allowing this to happen at Footscray. I can't think of any better place possibly in Melbourne for this to have been launched and to have this discussion. For Frank, for coming all the way from Sydney, thank you. You're not a field officer anymore, I know that, but I do know that you are allowed out every now and again. And for Penny to respond in the way that you have from another state government, in another state government context. Thank you so much.